The swarm is as smart as its smartest unit. So ask yourself, if something genuinely terrifies the Tyranids enough to make them run across the galaxy, what does that thing look like? Every overview of the Tyranids starts from the same place, the biology. The sheer staggering count of organisms, the acid, the swarm tactics, the consumption of worlds. All of it real, all of it documented. And if you're watching this, you already know it. You've seen the Tyranid overview. You know what a Hive Fleet does to a biosphere. You don't need the catalog of horrors repeated. What gets skipped in those overviews, what genuinely doesn't get examined, is the intelligence question. Not whether the Tyranids are smart, but what kind of intelligence the Hive Mind actually represents, and what that architecture tells us about the decisions it makes. Because if the Hive Mind is what the canonical lore says it's, and what the lore says is specific and significant, then the presence of the Tyranids in this galaxy isn't an event, it's the output of a calculation. And the most important thing you can ask about a calculation is what the input was. The Hive Mind is described in the Lexicanum as the gestalt collective consciousness of the entire Tyranid race. Not an instinct scaled to galactic size, a unified mind, a psychic embodiment of the Tyranid species' accumulated intelligence and strategic imperatives, processed through billions of individual organisms simultaneously. Every single Tyranid organism in a Hive Fleet is psychically reactive. Every creature contributes sensory data upward to the collective and receives direction back down from it. The whole system functions somewhere between a biological internet and a military command infrastructure, running on psychic resonance rather than physical cabling. That description is often read as meaning the intelligence is spread evenly across the swarm. It isn't. And that misreading is responsible for almost every intellectual underestimation of what the Hive Mind actually is. The synapse creatures are where the real function of the architecture becomes visible. Hive tyrants, neurotyrants, broodlords, the swarm lord. These organisms don't just participate in the Hive Mind's network. They are the processing layer. The relay conduits through which the Hive Mind's strategic intelligence gets transmitted downward to everything below them in the hierarchy. When a Hive tyrant is on a battlefield, the gaunts around it aren't just fighting harder. They're connected to something that is actually thinking about what they should do. The Hive tyrant isn't issuing orders to a mindless swarm. It's the expression of the Hive Mind's will at the battlefield level, and the gaunts are executing that will with whatever precision their biology allows. Remove the Hive tyrant. Cut the synapse connection. And here is exactly what the lore confirms happens next. Lesser organisms don't continue fighting on instinct with reduced efficiency. They regress entirely. Without a synapse presence in range, creatures that were operating as part of a single coordinated mind become disorganized, then feral, then cannibalistic. They turn on each other. The swarm that looked like a unified intelligence a moment ago becomes a collection of panicking animals. That behavioral collapse is the most revealing piece of evidence in the entire Tyranid Codex, and it's almost always treated as a game mechanic footnote rather than the fundamental proof of the intelligence architecture that it actually is. What the feral collapse demonstrates is this: the intelligence doesn't live in the base organisms at all. The gaunts are execution nodes. They receive instructions from above and act on them. Remove the instructions, and what remains underneath isn't a reduced intelligence. It's nothing. There is no tactical thinking at the gaunt tier. There is biology reverting to noise. This is a military command architecture. Intelligence expressed top-down through a hierarchy of processing and relay tiers, arriving finally at execution organisms that contribute sensory data upward and receive direction downward but originate nothing strategic of their own. So where does the intelligence actually live? At the top sits the Swarm Lord, the Hive Mind's most concentrated battlefield expression. Every lore source that discusses the Swarm Lord frames it in terms of strategic will and cunning, not destructive capacity. When the Swarm Lord is killed, the Hive Mind reconstitutes it. This isn't sentiment. The Swarm Lord represents the highest fidelity strategic processor the swarm can field. And losing that processing capability is a meaningful cost. The Hive Mind invests specifically in recovering this unit because what the Swarm Lord isn't a weapon, it's a brain. Below the Swarm Lord, Hive Tyrants, described as possessed of genuine autonomy and strategic cunning. Battlefield commanders, each capable of independent strategic reasoning, even when connection to the broader Hive Mind is weakened or degraded. As close to individual minds as the Tyranid species ever produces. Multiple Hive Tyrants operating across a planetary invasion aren't redundant. Each is processing local tactical data and translating the Hive Mind's strategic intent into situation-specific decisions. Below them, Neurotyrants. The Lexicanum describes Neurotyrants as Tyranid bioforms that act as focusing nodes for the shadow in the warp, serving as mobile command centers for the swarm. Where the Hive Tyrant exercises tactical command, the Neurotyrant is the signal specialist, amplifying and focusing the Hive Mind's psychic broadcast across local space and extending the reach of the synapse network. What makes the Neurotyrant tier significant for the intelligence argument isn't its psychic power. It's what the lore shows it actually doing with that power. In 10th edition material, a Neurotyrant manipulated a priest into leading an armored assault directly into a prepared ambush, leaving an entire Hive city undefended and exposed. The Neurotyrant identified the target's psychology, constructed a plausible deception, and executed it through psychic manipulation until the desired tactical outcome was achieved. Active strategic deception, not instinct, not hunger. A calculation that required modeling an enemy's cognition and steering him toward a predetermined result. Below the Neurotyrants, lesser synapse creatures maintaining the psychic link to organisms at the swarm's furthest tactical edges. Below them, execution organisms too simple to sustain independent Hive Mind connection. The Gaunts, the biological equivalent of the command's final output, the thing the strategy moves and points at a target. The community analogy is accurate. No single neuron is you, and no single Gaunt is the Hive Mind. But pull the Hive Tyrant tier out of any given engagement, and the neurons start eating each other. The scale of this architecture is worth being precise about. The Hive Mind processes sensory data from billions of organisms across the galaxy simultaneously. Every environmental experience of every organism in the swarm feeds data upward to the collective computation in real time. A planet under Hive Fleet invasion is being observed by millions of creatures simultaneously, each transmitting tactical data to a processing tier that produces strategic outputs and transmits them back down through the synapse relay. The Hive Mind's picture of any tactical situation is more comprehensive than any intelligence apparatus any other faction in the setting can assemble. And the decisions that computation produces are being implemented by a hierarchy that extends to the smallest organism on the field. Keep that architecture in mind, because it changes everything about the question we're actually here to ask. A bacterium moves toward nutrients. That movement requires no intelligence. It requires chemistry, a response to a chemical gradient, nothing more. There is no calculation, no decision, no assessment of alternatives. There is a response. A superintelligence moves for reasons. When the Hive Mind's processing tier computes a strategic output, that output isn't a response to a gradient. It's the solution to a multivariable problem, incorporating resource availability, threat assessment, trajectory modeling, and whatever information the swarm has accumulated across its entire evolutionary history. Billions of data points. Hive Tyrant-level cognition applied to a problem of galactic scale. The Tyranid Hive fleets crossed approximately 100,000 light-years of intergalactic void to reach the Milky Way. They didn't use the warp. Their Narwhal-based gravity manipulation keeps them in real space throughout the transit. They crossed 100,000 light-years of empty space, in real space, on what canonical sources treat as a trajectory, not random drift, a direction. Something decided to maintain that direction, and the timing reveals something. The Pharos was a psychic device of ancient Eldari origin, briefly activated during the Horus Heresy era, that broadcast a powerful signal into the intergalactic void. Community consensus built on codex material holds that this signal alerted the Tyranids to the existence of the Milky Way. The coordinated Hive Fleet approach began approximately 9,740 years after the Pharos signal was broadcast, with the main body reaching the Imperium around 745 M41. Nearly 10,000 years of transit time. The Tyranids were already in the void, already in motion, when the Pharos told them where to aim. The signal didn't start the movement, it gave it a destination. The Fandom Wiki's Astronomicon article notes that the Astronomicon, the Emperor's psychic beacon, draws the Tyranids like moths to a candle flame. Two powerful signals from the Milky Way, visible to a swarm already crossing the void. The swarm was heading in a direction. The signals confirmed where in that direction to aim. Whatever produced the decision to leave, it happened before the Milky Way confirmed its existence to the fleet. There is a rumor in this community. It has circulated since the early days of the Warhammer 40,000 setting, and it resurfaces reliably whenever someone looks at the Tyranid lore long enough to notice the gap between what the Hive Mind is and what it appears to be doing. The rumor goes like this. There is a rumor that they are running from something. Before engaging with that theory, here is exactly what the evidence is, because intellectual honesty matters when the question is genuinely open. The theory isn't confirmed Games Workshop canon. GW's official position, as conveyed in canonical sources, is that the Tyranids are extragalactic invaders consuming biomass. The Fandom Wiki states directly that the idea that Tyranids are running from something worse has been around seemingly forever, but there is nothing in the lore to explicitly back it up. Multiple community sources agree that a single line in an older Codex edition implied it, and the community isn't unified on whether that reading was supported by the text or extrapolated from it. One source claims GW explicitly debunked the theory, but that claimed debunking isn't traced to any specific document in the available record. What is confirmed, at least one Codex edition includes the theory as in-universe imperial conjecture, not as GW stating it's true, as a position held by scholars and inquisitors within the setting, documented in the Codex as their speculation about why the Tyranids are invading. GW wrote that conjecture into the book. They chose to give it a home, even if that home is the speculations of fallible imperial scholars, rather than a narrator confirming it as fact. Deliberate ambiguity in a setting this constructed isn't an accident. The alternative explanation with equal canonical support is starvation migration. The Tyranids are described in community consensus readings of Codex material as having consumed multiple galaxies before arriving here. What if they've done this before, repeatedly? Consume a galaxy, strip it to nothing, move to the next. Not because something is chasing them, because there is nothing left behind them worth returning to. Several community interpretations land here, and they're not wrong. In a certain sense, the Tyranids may be fleeing something. They may be fleeing the barren, lifeless galaxies they already consumed. The swarm has created a wake of dead space behind it. The motion forward isn't flight from a predator, it's flight from emptiness. That reading is, in one sense, more unsettling than the predator reading. It means the Tyranids are an extinction event that generates its own forward momentum. They can't stop. Stopping is death. The hunger isn't a motivation. It's the only available behavior for a species that has consumed everything else. But the intelligence architecture complicates both readings in the same way. A distributed superintelligence processing data at the scale the Hive Mind operates at doesn't move 100,000 light-years in a direction without having computed what is in that direction. Whether the input is no resources behind, resources ahead, or threat behind, resources ahead, the computation involves assessing whatever the swarm has encountered along the way. And the swarm was in the void for a very long time. 3 candidate answers exist in the lore with enough textual foundation to discuss seriously. The first is resource exhaustion, already examined. The tidiest answer and the one with the strongest direct canonical support. A mind sophisticated enough to model galactic biomass availability would know when a galaxy is empty. Moving on is the logical behavior. This doesn't require anything scarier than the Tyranids themselves, but it doesn't explain why the fleet's behavior in the void suggests directed movement rather than opportunistic drifting. And it doesn't engage the intelligence architecture's most interesting implication, that a mind this capable has already processed whatever it encountered in the crossing. The second candidate is the Enslavers. The Enslavers are one of the oldest factions in the 40K setting's deep history. They are described as other-dimensional beings that don't possess true physical bodies, existing at least partly within the immaterium. Their capabilities are specific and terrifying. They can locate psychers in the material plane from within the warp, and when they find one, they can possess that individual and convert them into a living portal through which more enslavers enter real space. Each possessed host becomes a gate. Each new enslaver that crosses through can repeat the process. The multiplication mathematics are catastrophic. During the war in heaven, the enslavers grew powerful enough on the psychic fallout of that ancient conflict to nearly extinguish all biological life in the Milky Way. They came that close. They didn't succeed only because the remaining factions developed enough resistance and the old ones had seeded successor species capable of fighting back. The conceptual connection to the Tyranid question isn't unreasonable. An entity that operates through the warp and hunts psychers would find specific difficulty with the Tyranid swarm. Individual organisms have no conventional warp souls, which means no psychic foothold points at the execution layer level. Enslaver possession requires a soul to grab, and Gaunts don't have one. And the shadow in the warp blankets a Hive Fleet's local space with psychic interference, disrupting warp connections and effectively blinding anything that navigates through the immaterium. A species that generates its own warp disruption field is, theoretically, quite effective at resisting an entity that operates through warp access points. The honest gap. No canonical source in this research places enslavers in the intergalactic void. Their documented habitat is the immaterium. The Tyranids don't use the warp. The bridge between enslaver threat capabilities and the extragalactic void isn't built in any canonical source retrieved here. The enslavers fit the threat profile of something a distributed biological superintelligence might flee. They don't fit the established geography of where the Tyranids came from. They remain a credible candidate for what waits in the Milky Way's warp. They are a less credible candidate for what was behind the Tyranids in the void. The third candidate is the void itself, or something in it that the lore maintains in deliberate silence. GW hasn't populated the extragalactic void with named entities in any canonical source available here. The setting is explicit about containing entities that predate the current age of the galaxy by epochs. The old ones who engineered the younger races, the Catan who consumed the energy of suns and whose shards still drive Necron politics. Forces whose existence predates the Chaos Gods by geological timescales. The setting has established a consistent pattern of hiding its most dangerous things in history and silence. The intergalactic void is the current silence. Whether that is a world-building gap or the setting doing what it consistently does with its most dangerous concepts, keeping them unnamed and implied, letting the framing do the work that explicit description would undermine, the lore doesn't say. What the intelligence architecture suggests about the nature of whatever forced the retreat, if anything forced it. A mind that adapts to anything it consumes, encoding biological innovations from every world it has ever devoured, would develop adaptive responses to anything it encounters frequently enough to model. The standard Tyranid response to a new threat is to consume organisms and adapt the swarm. It's what makes them so dangerous across multiple engagements against any military. Strategies that worked in the first contact often stop working in the second. Something that forced the Hive Mind to calculate retreat rather than adaptation would need to be something the adaptive mechanism doesn't address. Something the Tyranids can't consume because it lacks biology they can absorb, or exists in a state their digestion can't process. Something that operates through a principle the swarm's evolutionary history has no counter for. That category of threat is analytical inference from confirmed mechanics, not a canonical statement. But the lore doesn't foreclose it. There is one more question that surfaces every time this topic comes up, and it usually gets labeled a mystery and moved past. Why doesn't chaos engage meaningfully with Tyranid invasions? The answer isn't mysterious once you understand both halves of the architecture simultaneously. Individual Tyranid organisms lack conventional warp souls. Their psychic presence at the individual level is negligible, fundamentally different from humans and Eldari. A demon looking for psychic purchase points finds nothing in a gaunt. No soul to corrupt, no psychic signature to latch onto, no warp resonance to manipulate. Demon possession requires a soul. There are no individual souls in the execution layer of the swarm. Chaos corruption requires psychic resonance to exploit. The gaunts don't have it, but the hive mind itself does have a warp presence. The shadow in the warp, generated collectively by the hive mind, is unambiguously a psychic phenomenon operating in and affecting the immaterium. The collective mind projects into the warp and produces one of the most powerful psychic interference fields in the setting, disrupting all warp connections in local space, blinding navigators, and suppressing psyker abilities across the surrounding region. These two facts resolve cleanly when the tiers are kept separate. Individual organisms, psychically invisible to chaos predators. Collective hive mind, enormous warp presence generating a field that degrades chaos operation in the local area. Chaos predators engage at the individual level looking for souls, and the individual level has nothing. Meanwhile, any chaos entity attempting to operate in Hive Fleet proximity is already losing connectivity to the immaterium. The Tyranids aren't immune to chaos because of chaos's indifference. They're immune because the architecture's inherent properties leave chaos with no effective tools. Individual soullessness plus collective warp disruption equals an invasion force chaos can't corrupt, possess, or degrade through any standard mechanism. The shadow in the warp is discussed almost exclusively as an offensive tool. It disrupts psychers and navigators ahead of the fleet, degrading enemy coordination before first contact. That function is real and documented, but a species generating its own warp disruption field while crossing 100,000 light-years of intergalactic void in real space would also be generating that field against anything attempting to observe or pursue them through the warp during the transit. If something hunts through the immaterium and the Hive Fleet's passage through the void is blanketed in psychic interference, the fleet's crossing is, from a certain perspective, screened. The shadow in the warp isn't a wall, but it would make following the swarm through the warp significantly more difficult. Whether the hive mind's evolutionary history designed this as a defensive function, the lore doesn't say. The mechanics are what they are. Sarek is the last of the Silent Kings. He ruled the Saracon dynasty, the Necrontyr ruling body that led his species into biotransference, the process that stripped their organic bodies and locked their consciousnesses into soulless metal shells forever. He made that choice. He gave the deceiver what it needed to make biotransference happen. When the scale of what he had done was clear to him, he imposed exile on himself and left the Milky Way entirely. He spent ages in the intergalactic void. He encountered the Tyranids there. Sarek returned to the Milky Way in 774 M41. Not because his exile was complete, and not because something called him home. He returned because he saw the Hive Fleets moving through the intergalactic space he was occupying, and recognized what their trajectory implied. The Necron's long-term project was biorestoration, the return of Necron consciousness to organic bodies, which required a galaxy's worth of living biomass to accomplish. If the Tyranids consumed the Milky Way, that project ended permanently. Sarek came back to fight. At a location called Devil's Crag, He and Blood Angels commander Dante fought Tyranids as temporary allies. Both forces were too depleted afterward to resume hostilities with each other. The Silent King's encounter matters to the intelligence argument for a specific reason. When Sarek found the Hive Fleets in the intergalactic void, they were already moving in a coordinated direction. This isn't contested in the lore. The Tyranids he encountered were out in the space between galaxies, maintaining fleet cohesion, executing a plan the Hive Mind had already formed before it came anywhere near the Milky Way. That isn't the behavior of a starving organism drifting toward the nearest light. That is a directed transit, and the Hive Mind was maintaining it in real space, where there is no biomass to consume, no local stimulus to respond to, nothing except the crossing and whatever the swarm's sensors were processing along the way. What the swarm was processing out there is the question that doesn't have a canonical answer. The Imperium of Man is structurally oriented around one biological fact. The Emperor of Mankind exists in a state of living death on the Golden Throne, sustained at enormous ongoing cost for 10,000 years since the Horus Heresy. 1,000 psyker lives per day, the entire administrative and religious apparatus of a galaxy-spanning civilization bent toward keeping one being's body functional. The official explanation is the Astronomicon. The beacon the Emperor maintains allows Imperial navigators to pilot ships through the warp. Without it, the Imperium can't sustain its logistics across interstellar distances. This is canonical and sufficient. But the Fandom Wiki's Astronomicon article also describes it as what draws the Tyranids like moths to a candle flame. The signal keeping the Imperium functional in the short term is the primary broadcast that tells every Hive Fleet in the intergalactic void where the Milky Way is. The Emperor was described, before the Horus Heresy, as planning on a scale and timescale that exceeded any single human lifetime, building plans within plans, foreseeing threats that no one around him could perceive. The Golden Throne's official function is sustaining the Emperor's body. What else it might be, whether it serves a protective or containment function for something the galaxy isn't currently discussing, the canonical text leaves deliberately vague. If the Emperor's project extends beyond the threats the Imperium faces day to day and into something older and external, something the Hive Fleets might themselves be responding to, then the structure of the Imperium looks different than the standard reading presents it. Not just a civilization defending itself from its enemies, possibly a structure built against something that not even the Tyranids are willing to face. This isn't confirmed canon. It's a structural observation that fits within the logic the setting consistently operates by, and the lore threads it together deliberately rather than accidentally. The comparison to other fictional swarms is worth addressing directly, because the audience making it has identified something real. The Zerg from StarCraft and the Flood from Halo are legitimate analogs. All three are biological collectives with hive consciousness. All three consume and adapt. All three are described as existential threats within their settings. But the architecture differs in ways that matter. The Zerg Overmind had a single point of failure. Its death sent the swarm into chaos. The Hive Mind's processing intelligence is distributed across a hierarchy of Hive Tyrant tier organisms replicated across multiple separate fleets. Destroying one Hive Tyrant doesn't degrade the Hive Mind. Destroying an entire Hive Fleet doesn't end the invasion. There is no centralized node to target. The Flood Gravemind pursues synthesis and preservation. It wants to absorb and contain all knowledge and experience, achieving a kind of immortality through total assimilation. There is something it wants to save, even if saving it means the target never consents. The Tyranid Hive Mind wants nothing preserved. When a Hive Fleet finishes a world, nothing of what was there remains. No genetic archive, no preserved consciousness. Complete, final consumption. And then there is scale. The Zerg were a regional threat. The Flood were reset by a weapon built specifically to end them. The Tyranids crossed from another galaxy and are described as having consumed multiple galaxies before arriving here. The Zerg and the Flood both had answers available in their settings. The Hive Mind has no equivalent single target. There is no reset button, There is just the swarm, and more swarm behind it, still emerging from the intergalactic void in fleets that are still arriving. That is the distinction. Then move on. Return to the architecture one final time. The hive mind processes sensory data from billions of organisms. It reconstitutes its finest strategic units when they die. Its neurotyrant tier is capable of strategic deception, sophisticated enough to psychically manipulate enemy commanders into destroying their own defenses. It maintains fleet coordination across 100,000 light-years of intergalactic void, in real space with no local stimulus to respond to. It generates a warp disruption field that renders the swarm immune to most chaos interference and screens its transit from warp-based observation. It has no single point of failure. It has consumed multiple galaxies, and it's moving in a direction. Whatever computation the hive mind's processing tier performed, whatever data flowed upward from billions of organisms and was processed into a strategic output, the result was, leave what's behind us and go toward the Milky Way. The fleet was already in transit before the Pharaohs confirmed where to aim. The hive mind decided to leave before it knew exactly where it was going. That is either resource arithmetic, pure and simple, nothing behind, something ahead, or it's something more. The in-universe imperial conjecture that GW included in at least one codex edition, the speculation by imperial scholars that the Tyranids may be fleeing from a cosmic disaster or a fearsome race, was written into the setting and left unresolved. GW has maintained that ambiguity deliberately. The lore holds the question open. 3 honest candidates for what produced the output. Resource exhaustion, coherent, canonical, requires nothing scarier than the Tyranids themselves. Something warp native and enslaver adjacent. Fits the threat profile, doesn't fit the geography. Something in the extragalactic void that hasn't been named in any canonical source retrieved here. Consistent with the setting's design pattern of keeping its most dangerous things silent and implied. What the intelligence architecture implies about the threat's nature. Whatever it is, the hive mind's adaptive mechanism doesn't address it. A mind that adapts to anything it can consume didn't adapt to this. It moved. New hive fleets are still emerging from the intergalactic void. The invasion that reached the Imperium in 745 M41 was the vanguard. More is coming. All of it from the same direction. All of it from whatever is on the far side of that crossing. The hive mind is the only thing in the setting that knows what's back there. It has the cognitive architecture to have assessed it thoroughly. The Swarm Lord tier processing, the Hive Tyrant tier strategic cognition, the sensory data of billions of organisms that have been crossing the void for thousands of years. Whatever the swarm found during that transit shaped the computation that produced. Keep moving, don't stop, go toward the Milky Way. What does that look like? The lore hasn't answered it. The canonical text left the question open. Your answer has the same standing as any theory offered here, because the evidence genuinely doesn't settle this, and the best minds in the setting, the ones made of metal and 10,000 years old, came back from the void and started fighting without explaining what they saw while they were out there. Work backward from the architecture and tell me what you find in the comments. Subscribe if you want to keep going deeper into what the 40K setting is actually saying beneath the surface.